They never aged a single day in 40 years. They were never seen outside the hospital walls, and when investigators finally demanded answers, every record of their existence had vanished. Before we uncover one of the most disturbing medical mysteries in 19th century America, I need to know, where are you listening to this story right now? Are you at home, during a late-night drive, or perhaps lying in bed wondering what secrets your own town might be hiding? Drop a comment below and tell me. And if you're drawn to real historical accounts that were deliberately buried, stories that powerful people wanted erased from memory, then hit that subscribe button. Because what happened at Blackmoor Hospital wasn't just forgotten, it was systematically destroyed. And the women at the center of it all, according to every official document, they never existed. Let's find out why. The winter of 1847 brought more than snow to the isolated forests of northern Massachusetts. It brought Blackmoor Hospital, a towering structure of grey stone and darker promises, rising from the frozen earth like a monument to something the world wasn't quite ready to name. Built on land so remote that the nearest town, Ashford, lay 7 miles through dense woodland, the hospital was founded under the banner of progressive medicine and Christian charity. Dr. Cornelius Blackmoor, a respected physician from Boston with connections to several prominent families, presented his vision to the Massachusetts Medical Society with passionate eloquence. The state needed a place for those society had abandoned. The mentally ill, the destitute, the incurable, a place where modern science could flourish away from the superstitions and judgments of crowded cities. The society approved. Funds were allocated. Construction began in secret, with laborers brought in from distant counties who were paid generously to work quickly and ask no questions. By the autumn of 1848, Blackmoor Hospital opened its heavy iron doors to its first patients. The building stood 3 stories tall, with 2 long wings extending from a central administrative block. Small, barred windows punctuated the facade at irregular intervals, and a tall stone wall surrounded the entire property. The official capacity was listed as 100 beds, though rumors suggested the actual number of occupants often exceeded twice that. Dr. Blackmoor himself served as the institution's first director, overseeing a staff that included 3 physicians, an administrator, kitchen workers, groundskeepers, and, most notably, a corps of nurses whose presence would eventually become the source of whispered horror. In those early months, the hospital functioned much like any other asylum of its era. Patients arrived in locked carriages, committed by family members who could no longer care for them, or by courts that deemed them unfit for society. The diagnoses were varied and often vague: melancholia, hysteria, moral insanity, religious mania. Many were simply poor, elderly, or inconvenient to their relatives. Thomas Garrett, a journalist for the Boston Ledger, visited Blackmoor in the spring of 1849 and published what would be one of the few contemporary accounts of the facility's interior. His article, preserved in the archives of the Massachusetts Historical Society, described clean corridors, adequate food, and patients engaged in therapeutic labor in the hospital's gardens and workshops. He made particular note of the nursing staff. The care of patients falls largely to a dedicated group of nurses, Garrett wrote, women of serious countenance and unwavering discipline. They move through the wards with mechanical efficiency, speaking little but missing nothing. Dr. Blackmoor explained that these women were specially trained in the most modern techniques of patient management, a claim that, given their remarkable composure in the face of considerable human suffering, I have no reason to doubt. What Garrett didn't mention, perhaps didn't notice, was something that would only become apparent with the passage of years. The nurses he described in 1849 would still be there in 1870, looking exactly the same. Margaret Holloway was 14 years old when her mother was committed to Blackmoor in 1851. Diagnosed with puerperal insanity following the birth of her sixth child, Mrs. Holloway was transported to the hospital by her husband, a merchant from the coastal town of Newburyport. Margaret accompanied him on the journey, hoping to see where her mother would be staying, to offer some word of comfort before the inevitable separation. The girl's diary, discovered in 2003 in an estate sale in Vermont, provides a rare glimpse into the hospital from a visitor's perspective. Her entry from May 12, 1851, is particularly revealing. Father and I arrived at the hospital just after noon. The building is more fortress than hospital, all stone and iron and windows too high to see through properly. A woman in a grey dress and white apron met us at the entrance. She did not smile or introduce herself. She simply gestured for us to follow. The corridors inside smelled of lye soap and something else I couldn't name, something medicinal and cold. We passed several other nurses, all dressed identically, all moving with the same purposeful stride. None of them looked at us. None of them spoke to each other. It was as if they were parts of a single machine rather than individual women. Mother was taken to a room on the second floor. I was allowed only a moment with her. She gripped my hand and whispered, "The nurses, Margaret, watch the nurses. They don't sleep. They don't eat. I've been watching." Before she could say more, one of them appeared in the doorway. I hadn't heard her approach, and indicated that our time was finished. Father tried to ask about visiting hours, but the woman simply shook her head and walked away. As we left, I looked back at the building. In one of the upper windows, I saw a face pressed against the glass. I couldn't tell if it was Mother or another patient, but I saw something else too. Several windows along the third floor where shadows moved behind the glass. Not the shadows of patients, but of nurses, standing perfectly still, just watching. Margaret never saw her mother again. Mrs. Holloway died at Blackmoor 6 months later. The death certificate listed the cause as general decline. By 1855, Blackmoor Hospital had become a fixture of the regional landscape, its presence both known and unquestioned. The remote location meant few casual visitors, and the families who committed relatives there were often relieved to have the burden lifted, asking few questions about the care provided. The hospital's annual reports, submitted to the State Medical Board, showed acceptable mortality rates and documented various innovative treatments being employed. But among the working-class communities surrounding Ashford, stories had begun to circulate. Delivery drivers who brought supplies to the hospital reported that the same nurses who signed for goods in 1850 were still there in 1855, looking not a day older. Groundskeepers who worked the exterior of the property claimed they never saw the nurses during daylight hours in the courtyard or gardens, only patients and male orderlies. The nurses seemed to materialize only inside the building itself, moving through the wards in their synchronized patterns. One former orderly, James Mitchell, spoke to a reporter in 1857 after abruptly leaving his position at Blackmoor. The interview was published in a small regional newspaper that has since ceased publication, but a transcript was preserved by a local historical society. "I worked there for 2 years," Mitchell said. "I needed the money, and the pay was good. Too good, I realize now. They paid us extra to work the night shifts, and that's when I started noticing things that didn't sit right. The nurses ran the night shifts entirely, no doctors present after 8 in the evening. And the nurses, they never seemed tired, never took breaks, never ate or drank anything I ever saw. They would stand in the corridors for hours without moving, just watching the patient rooms. One night, I heard sounds from the 3rd floor, the ward where they kept the most difficult cases. I ran up to help, but when I got there, 3 nurses were already in the hallway. They hadn't been there a moment before. I would have seen them. They just appeared. They looked at me and one of them said, 'Return to your duties. This doesn't concern you.' Her voice was flat, like she was reading from a script. I heard sounds from behind those doors that I can't properly describe. Not exactly screaming, more like procedures, medical procedures, but wrong somehow. When I tried to ask about it the next morning, the head administrator told me that certain experimental treatments were being conducted under Dr. Blackmoor's direct supervision, and that I was not to discuss them with anyone, including other staff. That's when I knew I had to leave. Whatever was happening on that third floor, whatever those nurses were doing, it wasn't medicine, and those women weren't like any nurses I'd ever known. There was something hollow about them, like they were wearing human faces, but nothing was really behind the eyes. Mitchell's testimony was dismissed at the time as the ramblings of an unreliable employee. Dr. Blackmoor himself responded with a carefully worded letter to the newspaper, expressing disappointment that a disgruntled former worker would spread malicious fabrications about an institution dedicated to the humane treatment of the afflicted. The letter worked. The story died. Mitchell left the region entirely, and his whereabouts after 1858 remain unknown. But inside Blackmoor, behind those stone walls and barred windows, the nurses continued their work, and the patients continued to whisper among themselves about the women who never aged, never slept, and never, ever forgot a face. The 1860s brought civil war to America, tearing the nation apart in blood and ideology. While battlefields consumed thousands of lives and the nation wrestled with questions of freedom and humanity, Blackmoor Hospital continued its operations in near total isolation. If anything, the war provided cover. With the country's attention focused elsewhere, fewer questions were asked about what happened in remote institutions housing societies forgotten. Dr. Cornelius Blackmoor died in 1864. Officially of heart failure at age 72. His funeral in Boston was well attended by medical professionals who praised his pioneering work. Control of the hospital passed to Dr. Samuel Wexler, his longtime assistant, who made it immediately clear that nothing about Blackmoor's operations would change, especially not the nurses. By 1865, 17 years had passed since the hospital's opening. Normal human beings show 17 years of aging, the subtle deepening of lines around the eyes, the first threads of silver in dark hair, the slight stiffening of movements that comes with advancing years. The nurses of Blackmoor showed none of this. Eleanor Pritchard, whose husband worked as the hospital's bookkeeper from 1862 to 1868, kept detailed letters to her sister in Philadelphia. These letters, preserved by descendants and donated to the American Medical History Archive in 1998, provide a civilian observer's perspective on the increasingly strange atmosphere surrounding the institution. In a letter dated March 1866, Eleanor wrote, "My dear Charlotte, I accompanied Robert to the hospital today to deliver some ledgers he had been working on at home. While he met with Dr. Wexler, I was left to wait in the main hall. 3 nurses passed through while I sat there. Robert told me later these were the same women who had been there when he was first hired 4 years ago. Charlotte, I cannot adequately express how unsettling it was to observe them. They moved in perfect synchronization, their footsteps making no sound despite the hard floors. Their faces were smooth and unlined, not in the way of young women, but in a manner that seemed almost mask-like. When one of them glanced at me, I felt a chill run through my entire body. Her eyes held no warmth, no curiosity, nothing that I associate with human expression. She simply looked, assessed, and moved on." Robert says the hospital staff rarely speaks of the nurses directly. When they must, they refer to them by function rather than name. The second-floor nurse, the night attendant, never by Christian names. He says he's never heard anyone call them by name, and he's never seen any of them in Ashford on their days off, assuming they have days off at all. I told Robert I don't want to return there. Something about that place feels fundamentally wrong, though I cannot articulate exactly what troubles me so deeply. Eleanor's instinct was sound. By the late 1860s, the mortality rate at Blackmoor had begun to climb, though official reports submitted to the State Medical Board showed no such increase. This discrepancy would not be discovered until much later, when investigators began comparing the hospital's official documents against death certificates filed with local municipalities and burial records from nearby church cemeteries. The true death rate was nearly triple what Blackmoor reported. Pastor William Hendricks of the Ashford Methodist Church maintained meticulous records of all burials in the church cemetery, including those of Blackmoor patients who were interred there when families could not or would not claim the bodies. His ledgers, spanning 1848 to 1889, tell a grim story. In the hospital's first decade, Blackmoor patients were buried at a rate of approximately 8 to 10 per year, a number consistent with the mortality rates of similar institutions. But beginning in 1862, the numbers changed dramatically. In 1863, 17 Blackmoor patients were buried. In 1864, 23. By 1868, the number had reached 31. Pastor Hendricks noted something else in his personal journal, discovered by his great-grandson in 1972. In an entry from November 1867, he wrote, "Another delivery from Blackmoor today. The undertaker's wagon arrived just after dawn with 4 bodies. This makes 12 burials from that institution this month alone. The undertaker, Mr. Pemberton, appeared deeply troubled. When I inquired, he admitted that he no longer enters the hospital itself. The nurses now bring the deceased to the gate, where they transfer them to his wagon. He told me something that has haunted me all day. He said the nurses handle the bodies with disturbing ease, no visible effort despite the weight, no emotional response despite the frequency. Last week, when he arrived to collect a body, one of the nurses was standing at the gate holding the deceased man, as if he weighed nothing at all. When Pemberton expressed surprise, she simply placed the body in the wagon and walked away without a word. I have prayed for guidance regarding my growing concerns about Blackmoor. Something is deeply amiss within those walls, but I am uncertain how to address it or to whom I should bring these concerns." On le sait, Hendricks never did find an answer to his questions. He died in 1870 of pneumonia, his concerns unvoiced beyond his private journal. The patients, however, spoke freely, at least to each other. Catherine Wells was committed to Blackmoor in 1868, at age 34, diagnosed with nervous hysteria after refusing to marry the man her father had chosen for her. She was wealthy, educated, and articulate, exactly the type of woman who could be conveniently disposed of by declaring her mentally unfit. Catherine was released 2 years later through the intervention of an aunt who questioned the commitment. Upon her release, she wrote a series of letters to the Massachusetts Attorney General detailing her experiences. These letters were filed away and forgotten until they were rediscovered during a 1934 review of historical documents. They provide one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of life inside Blackmoor. In her most extensive letter, dated April 1871, Catherine described the nurses. "I must impress upon you the absolute necessity of investigating the nursing staff at Blackmoor Hospital. These women are not normal human beings, and I do not make this claim lightly or from any delusion. During my confinement, I observed them constantly. They worked in shifts, but the same 12 women rotated through all shifts. I never saw them eat, though I watched for nearly 2 years. I never saw them sleep. I never saw them exhibit fatigue, illness, or any normal human variability. More disturbingly, I came to recognize that they looked exactly as they did when I arrived. Not a single physical change in 2 years, no variation in their appearance beyond their identical uniforms. The other patients feared them intensely, and with good reason. These nurses administered punishments disguised as treatments. Prolonged isolation in darkness, ice baths that lasted hours, forced feeding of substances that caused violent illness. Patients who protested or resisted were taken to the 4th floor. Few who went to the fourth floor returned, and those who did were forever changed, silent, hollow-eyed, moving like automatons. I attempted to learn the nurses' names, thinking I might humanize them somehow, make some connection that would grant me mercy. But I discovered they had no names, at least none they would share. When I asked one directly, she stared at me for a long moment with those dead eyes and said only, "We are the nurses. That is sufficient." I believe Dr. Wexler knows exactly what these women are, though I cannot fathom what that might be. He defers to them completely. I witnessed him taking instructions from the head nurse on multiple occasions. She would speak in a low voice, he would nod, and then he would leave her to carry out whatever had been decided. The power structure in that institution is inverted. The nurses truly run Blackmoor, not the physicians. I implore you to investigate before more lives are lost or destroyed. Whatever is happening within those walls violates not only medical ethics, but basic human decency. Odile, the Attorney General's office sent a standard acknowledgement letter. No investigation was conducted. Catherine's detailed testimony was filed and forgotten. She never spoke publicly about Blackmoor again and died in 1903 without seeing any action taken on her reports. But by the early 1870s, whispers about Blackmoor had spread beyond the immediate region. Medical students in Boston spoke of it as a place where experimental procedures were conducted in secret. Families began quietly investigating before committing relatives, and some chose institutions farther away despite the additional expense and difficulty. The hospital's reputation was shifting, and certain people were beginning to notice. Among them was Dr. Henry Morrison, a physician and medical reformer who had made it his mission to improve conditions in America's asylums. In 1872, he added Blackmoor Hospital to his list of institutions requiring examination. What he would discover there would shake him to his core and set in motion events that would lead to the hospital's sudden, mysterious closure. Dr. Henry Morrison was not a man easily intimidated. At 53, he had spent nearly 2 decades investigating institutional abuses across New England, publishing reports that had led to the closure of 3 asylums and the prosecution of several administrators for criminal neglect. His reputation for thoroughness and his connections to influential reform-minded politicians made him a formidable opponent to those who profited from human suffering. In the spring of 1873, Morrison began his inquiry into Blackmoor Hospital. His initial approach was standard. He sent official letters to Dr. Wexler requesting permission to conduct an inspection, citing his credentials and the authority granted to him by the Massachusetts Board of Health. He expected the usual reluctant cooperation that most institutions provided. Instead, he received silence. After 3 unanswered letters, Morrison traveled to Ashford in person. His journal entry from May 17, 1873, describes his first direct encounter with Blackmoor. Arrived in Ashford this morning. The town is small, perhaps 200 inhabitants, with an economy that appears entirely dependent on servicing the hospital. I spoke with several merchants and tradesmen, attempting to gather information about the institution before approaching it directly. The responses were uniformly cautious. When I mentioned Blackmoor, faces would close off, eyes would dart away. One shopkeeper simply shook his head and returned to his work without another word. An elderly woman running a boarding house where I took a room was slightly more forthcoming. She told me, "That place keeps to itself, and we keep to ourselves where it's concerned. That's how it's been for 25 years, and that's how it'll stay." This afternoon, I hired a carriage to take me to the hospital. The driver, a young man named Thomas, grew visibly nervous as we approached. The road through the forest is poorly maintained, overgrown with vegetation that seems to press in from all sides. When the building came into view, Thomas stopped the carriage 100 yards from the gate. "This is as far as I go, sir," he told me. When I questioned him, he said, "The nurses come to the gate sometimes, just standing there watching. I don't go past this point." I walked the remaining distance alone. The gate was closed but not locked. The grounds were eerily silent. No birds singing, no wind in the trees. Just absolute stillness. I proceeded to the main entrance and knocked. I waited for several minutes before the door opened. A woman in a grey dress and white apron stood in the doorway. She did not greet me, ask my business, or acknowledge me in any way. She simply stood there, watching with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. I introduced myself and explained my purpose. She continued to stare. Finally, after an unsettling silence, she stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. The interior was exactly as I had read in the few accounts that exist. Stone floors, whitewashed walls, the pervasive smell of disinfectant. But there was something else, something none of the written descriptions had captured. A quality in the air itself, a heaviness that made breathing feel labored, and a sense of being watched from all directions simultaneously. The nurse led me to an office where I waited for 30 minutes before Dr. Wexler appeared. He was polite, but clearly displeased by my presence. When I explained that I intended to conduct a full inspection, he informed me that such an inspection would require prior approval from the hospital's board of directors, and that he could not permit me to proceed without proper authorization. I informed him that my credentials from the Board of Health provided all the authorization I required. He smiled, a thin, cold expression, and said that Blackmoor operated under special provisions that exempted it from standard inspections. When I challenged this claim, he simply repeated that I would need to seek permission through proper channels. I left, but not before observing something that has troubled me deeply. As Dr. Wexler escorted me back to the entrance, we passed through several corridors. I counted 7 nurses in those corridors. Not one of them was engaged in any visible task. They were simply standing, positioned at regular intervals, watching, and Dr. Wexler walked past them without acknowledgement, as if they were furniture rather than human beings. When we reached the door, I asked him directly, "Who are these nurses? Where do they come from?" He paused, his hand on the door handle, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. Then he said, "They have always been here, Dr. Morrison. They are as much a part of Blackmoor as the stones themselves." Then he opened the door and bid me good day. "I am convinced that something deeply wrong is occurring in that building. I will not be deterred by bureaucratic obstacles." Morrison returned to Boston, determined to pursue the matter through official channels. He contacted the Board of Health, the Massachusetts Medical Society, and several politicians he knew to be sympathetic to asylum reform. What he discovered shocked him. Blackmoor Hospital existed in a peculiar legal limbo. It had been established with state approval, but its charter contained unusual provisions that granted it extraordinary autonomy. The land had been donated by a private trust whose members were unnamed. Funding came partially from the state, but primarily from an endowment whose source was protected by legal seals. The board of directors that Wexler had mentioned consisted of men who appeared to have no other professional connections. Their names appeared on no other documents, held no other positions, and could not be contacted directly. In essence, Blackmoor Hospital was accountable to no one. Morrison's attempts to force an inspection through legal means were blocked at every turn. His requests disappeared into bureaucratic procedures that led nowhere. Politicians who had previously supported his work suddenly became unavailable or expressed doubts about the necessity of investigating an institution with no formal complaints. Even some of his reform-minded colleagues began to distance themselves, suggesting he was becoming obsessed with a single facility when there were so many others requiring attention. Frustrated but undeterred, Morrison decided on a different approach. If he could not inspect Blackmoor officially, he would gather testimony from those who had been inside. He would build a case so compelling that the authorities would have no choice but to act. He began seeking out former patients and staff members. This proved more difficult than anticipated. Many former patients had died. The mortality rate among released Blackmoor patients was disturbingly high, with many dying within a few years of leaving the institution. Those who survived were often difficult to locate, having moved away or been reclaimed by families who wanted no reminders of the commitment. But Morrison was persistent, and over the following months, he managed to conduct interviews with 6 former patients and 3 former staff members. Their testimonies were remarkably consistent, despite these individuals having no contact with each other and being separated by years of service. All of them spoke about the nurses. Jacob Rees, who had worked as an orderly from 1869 to 1871, provided particularly disturbing details. The nurses controlled everything after dark, Rees told Morrison. Dr. Wexler and the other physicians would leave by 8 o'clock every evening, and from that moment until dawn, the nurses ran the entire hospital. They would move through the wards conducting procedures. That's what they called them, procedures. Patients would be taken from their rooms to the treatment areas on the 3rd and 4th floors. You would hear sounds, mechanical sounds like equipment operating, but unlike any medical equipment I've ever encountered. And sometimes you would hear the patients calling out, not in pain exactly, but in confusion and fear. I asked one of the senior orderlies what the procedures were. He told me never to ask about them again, that several orderlies had been dismissed for showing too much curiosity. He said the nurses were conducting research approved by Dr. Blackmoor before his death and continued by Dr. Wexler. But he didn't know what kind of research, and he made it clear that not knowing was the only way to keep working there. Here's what haunted me most. The nurses never changed. I was there for 2 years, and in that time, I never saw any of them look tired, sick, or any different from one day to the next. They wore the same expressionless faces every single day, and their eyes, God help me, their eyes were like glass. There was nothing behind them, nothing human. Morrison documented everything meticulously, building his case page by page. By early 1874, he had compiled a report that detailed systematic abuse, suspicious deaths, unethical experimentation, and the presence of nursing staff whose very existence raised profound questions. He prepared to present his findings to the Massachusetts state legislature, confident that the evidence he had gathered would force an immediate investigation and likely closure of Blackmoor Hospital. He did not anticipate what would happen next. On March 3, 1874, Morrison's home in Boston was broken into. Nothing of value was taken, no money, no jewelry, no personal items. But every page of his Blackmoor research was gone. Months of interviews, documentation, correspondence, and analysis had vanished completely. Morrison reported the theft to the police. The responding officer seemed sympathetic, but offered little hope of recovery. When Morrison emphasized the importance of the documents, explaining they contained evidence of criminal activity at a state institution, the officer's expression changed. He became suddenly formal and distant. "Dr. Morrison," the officer said carefully, "I would suggest that some investigations are better left to proper authorities. A private citizen inserting himself into matters beyond his expertise can sometimes cause more harm than good." The message was clear. Someone knew what Morrison was doing, and they wanted him to stop. But Henry Morrison had not built his reputation by backing down from threats. If anything, the theft confirmed his suspicions that something criminal was being protected at Blackmoor. He began reconstructing his research, re-interviewing witnesses, rebuilding his case from memory and from the few notes he had kept in his office. He worked quickly, knowing that time was now a factor. Within 6 weeks, he had recreated the core of his report. It was not as comprehensive as the original, but it contained enough damning testimony to warrant official action. On April 18, 1874, Morrison traveled once again to Ashford, intending to make one final visit to Blackmoor before submitting his report. He wanted to observe the facility one more time, to ensure his memory of its oppressive atmosphere was accurate and not colored by the dramatic events of recent weeks. He checked into the same boarding house where he had stayed before. The elderly proprietor, Mrs. Gertrude Simmons, remembered him. She seemed troubled by his return. "Dr. Morrison," she said quietly as she led him to his room, "I must speak plainly. After your last visit, there were questions asked about you in town. Men came from the hospital asking who you spoke with, what you said, where you went. Those of us who value our peace told them nothing, but this is not a safe place for you to be asking questions." Morrison thanked her for the warning, but assured her he would be leaving the next day. He simply needed to see the hospital once more. That evening, he wrote in his journal, his final entry, "Tomorrow I return to Blackmoor. I confess to some apprehension, but I cannot let fear prevent me from completing this work. Too many lives have been destroyed within those walls. Too many voices have been silenced. If my research can bring even a measure of justice to those who suffered there, then whatever risks I face are acceptable." I find myself thinking about the nurses. In all my years investigating asylums, I have never encountered anything like them. They defy explanation. Where did they come from? Why do they never leave? Why do they not age? These questions haunt me as much as the abuses they facilitate. Tomorrow, I will look upon that grey stone building one last time. I will observe its windows, its walls, its heavy gates, and then I will return to Boston and ensure that the truth about Blackmoor Hospital is finally heard. Dr. Henry Morrison left the boarding house at dawn on April 19, 1874. He was seen walking along the road toward Blackmoor Hospital by a farmer working his field. The farmer would later tell investigators that Morrison appeared determined but troubled, walking with purpose despite the early hour. Morrison never returned to the boarding house. He was never seen alive again. When Dr. Henry Morrison failed to return to his Boston home by April 22nd, his wife Alice contacted the Boston Police Department. She explained that her husband had traveled to Ashford for one final visit to Blackmoor Hospital and should have returned 3 days earlier. The police assured her that he had likely been delayed and would return soon. He never did. By April 25th, Alice Morrison was frantic. She contacted Morrison's colleagues, his Reform Society associates, and finally the police in Ashford. The local constable, a man named William Thorne, agreed to investigate. His official report, filed on April 27th, provides a brief and frustratingly incomplete account, conducted inquiry regarding Dr. Henry Morrison of Boston. Mrs. Simmons at the boarding house confirmed Dr. Morrison stayed night of April 18th. He departed morning of April 19th, stating his intention to visit Blackmoor Hospital. Did not return to collect his belongings or settle his account. Proceeded to Blackmoor Hospital to inquire. Was received by Dr. Samuel Wexler, director. Dr. Wexler stated that Dr. Morrison did not arrive at the hospital on April 19th or any other recent date. Dr. Wexler expressed surprise at the inquiry and offered to have his staff search the grounds in case Dr. Morrison had suffered some mishap on hospital property. Search conducted. No evidence of Dr. Morrison found. Searched the road between Ashford and hospital. No signs of struggle or accident. Questioned local residents. Farmer Daniel Foster reported seeing a man matching Dr. Morrison's description walking toward hospital on morning of April 19th, approximately 7:30 a.m. No other witnesses. Conclusion: Dr. Morrison's whereabouts unknown, may have suffered accident in wooded area or changed his plans without informing family. Inquiry to remain open, but no evidence of foul play discovered. Alice Morrison refused to accept this explanation. She knew her husband had been investigating Blackmoor, knew he had been threatened, and knew he would never simply disappear without word. She hired a private investigator from Boston, a former police detective named Marcus Webb, to conduct a thorough search. Webb's investigation, documented in a lengthy report he provided to Mrs. Morrison in June 1874, revealed disturbing inconsistencies in Constable Thorne's findings. Webb walked the entire route from Ashford to Blackmoor multiple times, searching the surrounding woods. He found no trace of Morrison, but he did find something else. Approximately 100 yards from Blackmoor's main gate, concealed in thick underbrush off the road, Webb discovered Morrison's leather document case. It was empty, his journal, his notes, his identification papers, all gone. But the case itself remained, hidden as if someone had taken its contents and discarded the container where it would not be easily found. Webb presented this evidence to Constable Thorne, demanding a more thorough investigation. Thorne reluctantly agreed to question the hospital staff again. This time, Webb accompanied him. In his report, Webb described what happened. We arrived at Blackmoor at approximately 2 p.m. on June 12, 1874. Constable Thorne seemed nervous from the moment we passed through the gate. The building itself is imposing in a manner that goes beyond mere size. There is something about its presence that creates an instinctive feeling of wrongness. We were received by Dr. Wexler and several nurses. I counted 4 nurses in the entrance hall, all standing in perfect stillness, watching us with blank expressions. They did not blink, did not shift their weight, did not exhibit any normal human movement. They simply stood and watched. I showed Dr. Wexler the document case and asked him to explain how it came to be near his hospital's property. He examined it carefully, then said he could not explain it. He reiterated that Dr. Morrison had never arrived at the hospital. I asked permission to question the staff. Dr. Wexler hesitated, then agreed. However, when I attempted to speak with the nurses, they would not respond. They stared at me silently. When I pressed them with questions, they simply turned and walked away. Dr. Wexler explained that the nurses were not comfortable speaking with strangers and that their English was limited, as many had come from Europe. This explanation was clearly false. I had heard one of them give instructions to an orderly in perfect unaccented English only minutes before. When I pointed this out, Dr. Wexler's expression hardened. He stated that I had no legal authority to conduct an interrogation of his staff and that unless Constable Thorne had specific evidence of a crime, we should leave. Constable Thorne immediately agreed that we should go. He appeared eager to depart. As we left, I looked back at the building. Every window on the first 3 floors showed a nurse standing behind the glass, watching us leave. They stood motionless, their white aprons and caps creating an eerie uniformity. It was like being watched by dozens of identical statues. I am convinced that Dr. Morrison came to this hospital and never left. I am equally convinced that the staff knows exactly what happened to him. But without the cooperation of local authorities and without legal grounds to search the premises, I cannot prove these convictions. Webb's report ended with a recommendation that Mrs. Morrison seek help from state authorities in Boston, as the local law enforcement in Ashford appeared either incompetent or compromised. Alice Morrison did exactly that, bringing Webb's findings to the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. The response was disappointing. The Attorney General's office determined that while Dr. Morrison's disappearance was certainly concerning, there was insufficient evidence to warrant state intervention in what appeared to be a local missing person case. They suggested that Mrs. Morrison continue working with local authorities and hire additional private investigators if she felt the need. Alice Morrison spent the next 3 years and nearly all of her savings attempting to discover what happened to her husband. She hired 2 more investigators. Both reached the same conclusion as Webb. Morrison had definitely reached Blackmoor Hospital, and something had definitely happened there. But the wall of silence surrounding the institution could not be penetrated. By 1877, financially exhausted and emotionally devastated, Alice Morrison was forced to abandon her search. Her husband was declared legally dead in 1880. She never remarried and spent the rest of her life convinced that Blackmoor Hospital had murdered him. She died in 1903, having never learned the truth. But Morrison's disappearance had consequences beyond his widow's suffering. His case, combined with the testimony he had gathered before his death, had reached sympathetic ears in Boston's reform communities. Quietly, carefully, a network of concerned physicians, journalists, and politicians began monitoring Blackmoor Hospital. They could not get inside. They could not force an official investigation, but they could watch and they could document. Between 1875 and 1883, several disturbing patterns emerged from this monitoring. Death certificates filed for Blackmoor patients increased dramatically, from an average of 25 per year in the early 1870s to more than 60 per year by 1880. The causes of death were almost universally listed as general decline, consumption, or apoplexy, vague terms that could mean anything. Supply orders for the hospital, tracked through merchants in Ashford and Boston, showed increasing quantities of chloroform, ether, and various sedatives, far exceeding what would be needed for normal medical care. There were also orders for unusual equipment, devices whose purposes were unclear, but which were described in invoices as electrical apparatus, restraint mechanisms, and precision instruments. The nursing staff never changed. Former employees from the 1850s and former employees from the 1880s, when interviewed independently, described the same nurses, identical in appearance, behavior, and number. A core group of 12 women who appeared to be in their 30s, who never aged, who never left the hospital grounds, and who effectively controlled the institution's daily operations. In 1883, these concerns finally reached someone with the power and determination to act. Representative James Ashcroft, a newly elected state legislator with strong reform credentials, took up the cause of Blackmoor Hospital. Ashcroft had personal reasons for his interest. His sister had been committed to an asylum years earlier, and he had witnessed firsthand the abuses that occurred in such institutions. Ashcroft used his political position to demand a full state investigation of Blackmoor. He introduced legislation that would have required unannounced inspections of all state-connected medical facilities, with Blackmoor specifically named in the bill's preamble. He gave speeches on the floor of the legislature detailing the suspicious circumstances surrounding Dr. Morrison's disappearance and the hospital's impenetrable secrecy. For several months, it appeared that Ashcroft would succeed where Morrison had failed. The legislation gained support. Newspapers began covering the story. Public pressure mounted. An inspection of Blackmoor Hospital seemed inevitable. Then, in August 1883, Representative Ashcroft suddenly withdrew his legislation. In a brief statement, he announced that after further review, he had determined that concerns about Blackmoor Hospital were unfounded and based on unreliable testimony. He apologized for any distress his earlier statements had caused to the hospital's administration and staff. The reversal was so complete and so sudden that many of Ashcroft's supporters suspected coercion. But when pressed, Ashcroft refused to discuss the matter further. He never again spoke about Blackmoor Hospital publicly, and when his term ended in 1884, he did not seek re-election. He returned to private law practice and lived quietly until his death in 1912. Years later, after Ashcroft's death, his personal papers were donated to the Massachusetts State Archives. Among them was a journal entry from August 1883 that has never been fully explained. I have seen what I cannot unsee. I have been shown what I cannot unknow. The nurses are not, I cannot even write it. God help me, I cannot write what I now understand. My silence is not cowardice, but necessity. There are some doors that must remain closed, some truths that would shatter the world if spoken. I will take this knowledge to my grave, and I pray that others will be spared the burden of knowing. With Ashcroft's capitulation, the last serious attempt to investigate Blackmoor Hospital died. The institution continued its operations for another 6 years, slowly fading from public consciousness. To the outside world, it was simply another asylum, neither better nor worse than dozens of others scattered across the country. But inside those walls, the nurses continued their work, and the patients continued to disappear into that fourth floor, returning changed or not returning at all. Until the night of October 17th, 1889, when everything ended. The first indication that something had changed at Blackmoor Hospital came from an unlikely source, a telegraph operator in Ashford named Samuel Pierce. On the morning of October 18th, 1889, Pierce arrived at his office to find his equipment had been active during the night, though he had closed the office at 6 o'clock the previous evening as usual. The tape showed a single message sent at 2:47 a.m., directed to the Massachusetts State Medical Board in Boston. Blackmoor sealed. Stop all staff departed. Stop patients transferred. Stop facility closed permanently. Stop no further communication. Stop. The message was unsigned. Pierce immediately contacted his supervisor in Boston, who confirmed that no authorization for such a message had been given. When Pierce examined his office more carefully, he found that someone had entered during the night. The lock on his door had been opened, though not forced, operated his equipment, and left without disturbing anything else. The message made no sense. Blackmoor Hospital housed over 200 patients. The transfer of that many people would require coordination, transportation, advanced notice to receiving institutions, and considerable time. None of that had occurred. By noon, word of the strange telegraph message had reached Boston. The State Medical Board, confused and concerned, dispatched 2 administrators to Ashford to investigate. They arrived on the afternoon of October 19th and immediately proceeded to Blackmoor Hospital. What they found would remain officially classified for 40 years. The administrator's confidential report, finally released in 1929 and now available in the Massachusetts State Archives, describes a scene that defies easy explanation. We arrived at Blackmoor Hospital at approximately 3 p.m. on October 19, 1889. The main gate stood open, unusual in itself, as the gate had historically been kept closed at all times. We proceeded to the main building and found the front entrance unlocked. The interior was completely silent. We called out but received no response. We began a systematic search of the facility. The first floor appeared to have been abandoned in an orderly fashion. Patient rooms were empty but clean. Medical equipment remained in place. There were no signs of struggle or haste. It was as if the inhabitants had simply stood up and walked away, leaving everything behind. The second floor was identical. Empty rooms, undisturbed belongings, perfect order. We found patient records in the administrative office, but many files appeared to be incomplete or missing pages. Most disturbing was the staff roster, which listed only Dr. Samuel Wexler by name. The nursing staff section contained only the notation, Permanent Nursing Corps, 12. No names, no details, no identification. The third floor showed the first signs of something deeply wrong. Several rooms contained equipment we could not identify, metal frameworks, electrical devices, leather restraints of unusual design. The walls bore marks we could not explain, scorching in patterns that seemed deliberate rather than accidental. One room contained what appeared to be an operating theater, but the equipment was unlike anything we had seen in medical practice. We approached the fourth floor with considerable trepidation. Access was via a single stairway, and the door at the top was solid iron, nearly 6 inches thick. It stood open. We climbed the stairs. The fourth floor was a single large room occupying the entire top level of the building. What we found there. Here, the report contains a section that has been redacted, approximately 2 pages of text that were removed before the document was released in 1929. The report resumes, and so we immediately descended and sealed the entrance to the fourth floor. We agree unanimously that this level should never be accessed again and that no description of its contents should be made public. As for the patients and staff, we found no trace. Over 200 patients, a dozen nurses, Dr. Wexler, and approximately 15 other staff members had vanished completely. We searched the grounds thoroughly, including the cemetery where deceased patients had been buried. All graves appeared undisturbed. We found no bodies, no evidence of violence, no indication of where anyone had gone. It was as if the entire population of Blackmoor Hospital had simply ceased to exist between the evening of October 17th and the morning of October 18th. We recommend that this facility be permanently closed, sealed, and placed under guard. We further recommend that all inquiries about Blackmoor Hospital be directed to this office and handled with utmost discretion. There are elements of this situation that we do not understand and that we believe should not be made public knowledge. The recommendations were implemented immediately. On October 25, 1889, Blackmoor Hospital was officially closed by order of the State Medical Board. The building was sealed, every door and window was bricked over, heavy chains were placed across all entrances, and no trespassing signs were posted throughout the grounds. The official explanation given to the press was that structural defects had made the building unsafe and that patients had been transferred to other facilities. No details were provided about where the patients had gone, and inquiries from family members were met with bureaucratic delays and vague assurances. Most families eventually gave up, trying to learn the fates of their committed relatives. A few persisted for years, writing letters that went unanswered, filing complaints that led nowhere. By 1900, most of the former patients' families had died or moved on, and Blackmoor faded from public memory. But the building itself remained, sealed and silent in its forest clearing. Local residents avoided it. The road leading to the hospital gradually disappeared under vegetation. The walls surrounding the property crumbled in places, but remained sufficient to discourage trespassers. In 1934, a team of historians and medical researchers requested permission to examine the sealed hospital as part of a study on 19th century asylum practices. Their request was denied without explanation. A second attempt in 1952 received the same response. The building remained sealed, its secrets protected by bureaucratic inertia and perhaps by something more deliberate. The last official document mentioning Blackmoor Hospital is a memorandum from 1967, discovered in state archives in 2011. Written by an unnamed administrator in the Department of Health, it reads, "Regarding inquiries about the Blackmoor Hospital site, the facility remains sealed by order issued in 1889. This order has never been rescinded and should remain in force indefinitely." The reasons for the original sealing were not documented in public records and appear to have been deliberately obscured. However, based on the classified report from 1889, which I have read under strict confidentiality protocols, I can state that the sealing was absolutely necessary and that the facility should never be reopened under any circumstances. The land and structure are to remain state property in perpetuity. Any requests for access, demolition, or repurposing should be denied without discussion. The official position is that the building is structurally unsound and contaminated with hazardous materials, making any entry dangerous. This position should be maintained regardless of evidence to the contrary. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. Blackmoor's doors must remain sealed. The building still stands today, though few know of its existence. The forest has reclaimed much of the property. The stone walls are covered in ivy and moss. The bricked-over windows stare blindly at the overgrown grounds. Local hunters and hikers occasionally stumble upon it, but they never stay long. There is something about the place that encourages immediate departure, a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched from within the sealed structure. Modern curiosity seekers who discover references to Blackmoor Hospital in historical archives find that most records have disappeared. Patient files are gone. Staff rosters are incomplete. Correspondence has been lost. The institution that operated for 41 years and housed thousands of patients has been almost completely erased from documented history. Almost, but not entirely. Fragments remain: scattered diary entries, brief newspaper mentions, faded photographs, and the testimonies collected by Dr. Morrison before his disappearance. These fragments tell a story that has never been fully assembled, a mystery that has never been solved. Who were the nurses of Blackmoor Hospital? Where did they come from? Why did they never age, never leave, never exhibit normal human characteristics? What happened on that fourth floor? Where did 200 patients and all the hospital staff disappear to on a single night in 1889? And why has the government kept this facility sealed for over a century? The official answer is that there is no mystery, just an old asylum that was closed due to structural problems, its records lost to time and bureaucratic inefficiency. But those who have studied the available evidence, who have read the surviving testimonies, who have seen the fear in the words of people like Representative Ashcroft, they know better. They know that Blackmoor Hospital was something more than an asylum. Something was happening within those walls that defied normal explanation, something involving a group of women who should never have existed. The building remains sealed. The fourth floor remains closed. And whatever truth lies within those stone walls remains locked away, protected by layers of bureaucratic secrecy, and perhaps by something deeper. A recognition that some knowledge is too dangerous to uncover, some questions too terrible to answer. The nurses of Blackmoor Hospital have vanished from official records as completely as they vanished from the hospital itself on that October night in 1889. No birth records, no death records, no documentation of their existence beyond the fragmented testimonies of those who encountered them. It is as if they were never real at all, as if they were simply a shared delusion, a collective nightmare experienced by patients and staff alike. But the sealed building suggests otherwise. The classified reports suggest otherwise. The disappeared investigators and silenced reformers suggest otherwise. The nurses were real. They existed. And whatever they were, whatever inhuman purpose they served within those walls, was important enough that powerful forces worked to erase every trace of their existence. Blackmoor Hospital stands as a monument to that erasure, a sealed tomb of stone and secrets, slowly disappearing into the forest that surrounds it. In another century, it may collapse entirely, burying its mysteries forever beneath fallen stones and earth. But for now, it remains, waiting, silent. Its bricked-over windows reflecting nothing but the passing seasons, its locked doors keeping watch over something that the world decided it was better off not knowing. And somewhere, in the fragmentary records that survived the purge, in the frightened words of those who saw and tried to tell, the truth waits, not complete, not fully clear, but present enough to disturb, to haunt, to make us wonder about the institutions we trust, the authorities we believe, and the careful lies we tell ourselves about the world we think we understand. The macabre history of Blackmoor Hospital is not just the story of an asylum, it is the story of systematic erasure, of truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge, of women who existed in the spaces between official reality and nightmare. They should never have existed. According to every document that matters, they never did. But the sealed hospital knows better, and so do those who dare to ask what really happened in those silent corridors, under the watch of nurses who never aged and never left. The answer remains locked behind bricked-over windows and iron doors, and perhaps that is where it should stay. Some histories are too macabre to be fully known. Some nurses should remain nameless. Some hospitals should stay sealed. Blackmoor has taught us that much, at least.